I'm Mary Taggart Sykes. I'm your Community Awareness Coordinator for the Fort Worth Library System. And I'd like to welcome you to the first program of our World War I series. This is North Texas and World War I, before, during, after, and today. Our speaker will be Jim Hodgson, the director of the Fort Worth Aviation Museum, and he is also the chair of the Texas World War I Centennial Commemorative Association. So a little bit of housekeeping to make sure that you don't miss any of our fabulous programs. Be sure to pick up one of these at the back of the building on our table. This is all of our World War I programs and our film series. In addition, if you'll pick up one of these brochures, this will show you what our programs for adult, teen, and children's are for the summer chapter of our programming session. And that's about it for housekeeping. Like I said, I'd like to welcome you here, and I'd like to welcome Jim Hodgson. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary. Good afternoon, folks. As Mary mentioned, this presentation is called World War I in Texas, Before, During, After, Today. There are things that we all utilize on a daily basis here that you may not be aware that goes all the way back to the First World War. The impact of the First World War years on not only Texas and the United States, but specifically on Fort Worth, are really turning points in a lot of people's history. We're going to explore a lot of that this afternoon, and I would like to refer to this a little bit of like connect the dots. So we'll get started. First thing here is we're going to talk about Texas from 1900 to 1920 and then today, and the effects of the war on people, places, and things. A little bit of recap on the war. Over 4 million Americans served in World War I, 116,000 of whom died in the conflict. That's Americans. There could very well have, that number could very well be much, much higher. The records we found from the First World War and what was reported back in those days has been changed on a number of different occasions. So this number could well be 140,000. The Great War changed everything. It began the American century. It set America on a path to superpower status, and it set the stage for the next century of war and warfare. So here's a little on the recap on Texas involvement itself. Nearly 1 million Texas men registered for the draft. There were women who were Texans who did serve in the military, but it was very limited. But as far as the men were concerned, and they were required to register, there were nearly 1 million of them. The war was very unpopular, or let's just say that it was very mixed in terms of whether people supported it or didn't support it. The registration for the draft was unpopular. It was relatively easy for people to get deferred, but that wasn't readily known by a lot of people. So there were any number of folks who left and attempted to be draft doctors and that type of thing. For instance, if you worked on a farm, in many cases you were exempt, or you were required not to even register for the draft because you were an essential service that needed to be back home. Nearly 200,000 Texans actually served. 5,171 Texans died in service. That number, again, is somewhat suspect for a number of different reasons and may actually be almost twice as high as that. But this is what is generally published as the number of casualties. A third of them occurred in the United States, mostly training accidents and those types of things, and then many of them from the Spanish flu in 1918. 36,000 African Americans served in Texas. That's 18%, and that's a percentage from an ethnic standpoint. 18% of all of the African Americans in Texas served. We have a woman who is working with the Texas Historic Commission now, who has been doing a study on it. It's called No Man's Land, and I'll show you something about that later on. But it's about the African Americans from East Texas who served. And she's identified at least 11,000 African Americans from East Texas who served. A lot of them from East Texas served as lumberjacks, and then they served as pioneers and things like that in the war once they went overseas. 50,000 Mexican Americans approximately served. Anybody know why we say approximately on the Mexican Americans?
they was classified as Caucasians?
Exactly. Mexican Americans were considered to be Caucasians or white. So we don't really have a good feel for how many Mexican Americans actually served. And they actually served and considered themselves with a number of different titles: Mexican Americans, American Mexicans, Tejano Americans, a number of different names. And there were issues regarding them that came up during the war. Consider that this was a mobilization on a massive scale. Nothing like this had ever taken place in the United States, or in the world for that matter, but in the United States there had never been a mobilization of this sort. And considering that the ethnic backgrounds of people who were living in the United States at the time were from literally hundreds of other countries. So one of the first issues that they had to deal with in the mobilization was language and training. They started trying to train everybody in English, but they quickly learned, and a lot of this came to the fore because of the Mexican Americans here, is that there was a great deal of difficulty in trying to train basic skills, military skills in English when it was a second language for many, many people. Russians, Ukrainians, Polish, Germans, although there weren't a lot of Germans that served, French, any number of different things. So out of a place called Camp Gordon in Georgia, there was an experiment that was done there where these ethnic groups were brought together, and they were trained by people who spoke their language for the basic military skills. And then they would be returned after that and integrated with their units. And that became a very good way to accelerate the training because it had been so slow and bogged down. And it's referred to as the Camp Gordon Plan. 6,000 Native Americans from Oklahoma and Texas served for Texas. They had, again, one of the highest percentages of any ethnic group that served in the military. Texas. Okay, there'll be a test on this later, so keep track of all these numbers. Just looking at Texas from 1900 to 1910 in population and ranking within the United States, you'll notice that in 1900 San Antonio was the largest city in Texas. In fact, it was referred to, especially after the First World War, as Military City USA. Houston was number 2 with 43,000, and Dallas was the third at 42,000. Fort Worth wasn't even in the top 100. In fact, no other Texas city was in the top 100. By 1910, only 10 years later, Fort Worth pops up at number 75, but you can see that the numbers, and this doesn't really have anything to do with the war at this point, but you can see the growth that's starting to take place in Texas, and the urbanization a little bit that's starting to take place. Now, Texas pre-1910, in terms of military posts, there were only 6. Fort Bliss, Fort Clark, Fort McIntosh, I believe it is, and then the San Antonio area, and a couple of others, Fort Brown and a couple others down here along the border. Some of these predated the Civil War. Fort Clark, for instance, was 1836. But this was the extent of the military presence in the United States in 1910. Most of this, what was going on in 1910 along the Mexico-Texas border? The Mexican Revolution, right? Yeah, so that was going on. So there was a lot of activity along the border, depending on which government or which people were in power at the point in time. There was also a lot of refugee activity that was going on across the border, and it was not simply farm workers. A lot of doctors, lawyers, bankers, businessmen from Mexico were streaming back into the United States to get away from the turmoil that was taking place in Mexico. But you'll notice these are all named forts. We're going to start talking about camps a little bit. Do you know what the difference is between a camp and a fort? Forts were permanent. Camps were considered temporary. So when we talk about Camp Bowie, it was originally established to be a temporary facility. So this is where we were at in 1910, and the population of Texas was just under 4 million, which made us the 5th largest state in the United States. So this is pretty much what Texas, especially rural Texas, looked like at the time. This is from Mission, Texas, but you'll notice we've got an ox cart, a couple oxes, and dirt road, and there is a car back here. But what you're going to see is that there was only about 150 miles of paved highway in the entire United States in 1910. There were about 40 cars in Dallas and Fort Worth both. And if you wanted to drive from Dallas to Fort Worth, that was going to be a 9-hour trip. So that's why, if you're familiar with what was called the Interurban Railway, it was the rail system, essentially a streetcar system, went from Dallas to Fort Worth. That was the quickest and easiest way to travel back and forth, because there were no paved highways. Now, at this point in time, there were 725 different manufacturers of vehicles in Texas building those vehicles on 125 different wheelbases. So there was absolutely no standardization at all in the vehicles or the highways or the roads. There weren't any highways, there was just roads. My father, for a period of time, grew up in South Dakota, and he mentioned that they traveled from South Dakota to San Diego, and it was about 1912 when they did that. And so they traveled in an old Haynes touring car and went from South Dakota to San Diego, and it took them 3 weeks. And they were never on pavement at all, except when they got to San Diego. So that's pretty much what the United States was. Oil had recently been discovered in Spindletop, and so we could see what the development of oil was like at Spindletop, but that was not common throughout the state of Texas yet. The internal combustion engines were just starting to come along, so there was not a lot of demand. You have to consider that Texas in 1910 is not terribly different from what it was right after the Civil War. It was essentially coal and steam. The railroads had been the only real development of technology that had come into the state since the Civil War. So we're really talking about post-Civil War era. Cotton was king, and you'll notice that it's all done by hand at this point in time. Cotton was one of the biggest industries across the state. And then, of course, ranching. That's always been big here. But one of the things that was consistent from early 1900s up through 1910, just before the war, and then we're going to see as a common theme throughout this time period, is prejudice prevailed. Initially, prior to the war, it was prejudice regarding African Americans, Native Americans, Mexican Americans. It was not necessarily some of the other ethnic groups yet, but prejudices prevailed. Now, these are where the big changes had taken place after the Civil War. You'll see these blue lines are railroad lines, and you notice they go from San Antonio to Houston and up around the Dallas-Fort Worth area. But that's about it, not much down here in the South, and that's post-Civil War. That's just right after post-Civil War. By 1909, you can see that the rail system has really taken over the state. And if you're familiar at all with the trail system, trail and driving cattle and all of those types of things, the railroads are what killed the trail system. Because you no longer needed to drive cattle up, you just needed to get them to a train station somewhere, and then you're going to be able to bring them to market. In 1911, Texas became the state with the most railroad mileage in the entire country, and that's something that still holds today. But we're still pre-war here. Now, during the war, a lot of changes took place. We went from military camps or forts at that time of 6 to 1919 we had 24. We went from 0 airfields in 1910 when aviation first became exhibited here in the state to 1919 where there were about 15. This is about half of all of the mobilization in the entire United States took place here in Texas. And it took place here for a number of factors. One primary one being the good weather. That for the most part there weren't a lot of weather issues in terms of snow and those kinds of things, except for some of the anomalies. Now, all of these forts were built. You'll notice a number of forts were built in this area, the Big Bend, and then of course San Antonio got very big, and Houston and Galveston, Camp Mabry up in Austin, and then up in Waco. But then there was a bunch that took place up here in North Texas. And then, of course, there's a little bit still down here in South Texas. But one of the things that continued throughout this entire period of time is, as we approach the First World War, and I contend that Texas, as opposed to all of the other states, truly entered the war in 1914, if not earlier than 1914. Even though the war didn't start in Europe until July of 1914, we were already involved because of the border activity that was taking place. So 1900 to 1920 is generally referred to as a progressive era. There were many changes in agriculture and lumber. Oil was being discovered. The railroads were expanding. Politically, things were happening in terms of suffrage. Women were starting to demand that they have a vote and in some limited cases they were being allowed to vote in county elections. Segregation was still fairly much of a norm. There was growth that was taking place all over. You saw those population numbers where cities were doubling in periods of 10 years or so. And there was a movement from out in the country into the cities. And prohibition was also started up. For a number of reasons, we'll talk about that. But the border conflicts continued from 1910 during the Mexican Revolution all the way up through the war. Part of it was because of the unrest that was going on in Mexico. Part of it was because of the German influence that was taking place. Germany knew early on that they needed to keep America out of the war as much as possible. That they could pretty much function in Europe and work with their allies in Europe, the Central Powers in Europe, and could probably win the war in Europe as long as America did not come into the war. So they started at an early point in time, even before the war started, to try to keep our attention away from Europe. Meanwhile, what we were doing was supplying goods, a lot of goods to Europe during that time period. But the border conflict continued to the point in time where, as most of you may know, here the Zimmerman telegram. Now, I've been doing some studying on the Zimmerman telegram as to whether that's really the thing that pushed us into the war, and I don't believe so. I think it's really the final straw, because there was German activity in the United States actually that predates the war in terms of sabotage cells and things like that. But the Zimmerman telegram, if you will remember, was the German government told the Mexican government that if they would support the Germans and declare war on the United States, that after the war was over, they would give them back Texas, Arizona, and New Mexico. Well, there were a lot of things that were taking place down here. They were actively soliciting the African Americans to go to Mexico, and then once they get to Mexico, the modern army to go back up and attack the United States. Germans were the largest ethnic group within the United States at that time. The population of the U.S. was about 100 million. There were approximately 110 to 111 million German Americans in the United States, 40 to 50,000 of which were card-carrying, registered German Army reservists. So there was a high concern that we had within the population of the United States, the ability for a lot of unrest if these Germans started to take action. They were also being encouraged to go to Mexico, where they would be armed and trained. The Germans supplied officers to Mexico for training purposes. And then we had the incidences in 1914 of Tampico, the thing that took place in Tampico about the oil, and then the attacks on Veracruz, or the invasion of Veracruz. So in 1914, we were almost at a state of war with Mexico. In fact, if it were not for a conference between Brazil, Argentina, and Chile, or what they refer to as the ABCs, that took place in Niagara, and it stopped any more aggression from taking place between Mexico and the United States. But there was constant unrest. So again, we had 200,000 Texans who served, 36,000 African Americans, 50,000 Mexican Americans, and 6,000 Native Americans. We have very few pictures of Mexican Americans in uniform as a group, because unless we find some that was taken by them, they were mostly integrated within the white units. The African Americans, once they went to Europe, were not allowed to fight with the U.S. forces. They were assigned to the French, and they fought with the French. In many cases, they were not allowed to go into combat. They were held back to be cooks and drivers and things like that. Oh, did forget one thing here. All of these forts and camps and airfields that were built here, most of them were constructed out of wood. Most of that wood came from East Texas. Most of it was harvested by the African Americans who lived in that area. Each one of these forts or camps were built to the tune of about $3 million in 1910 dollars. So back to this for just a second. So the Native Americans were integrated into the units pretty well. But now, have you ever heard of the code talkers in World War II? Okay. That started in World War I. It started here at Camp Bowie, with Choctaws primarily, but with the Native Americans here. They went to Europe, and what they found is the battlefield in Europe had become stagnant. It would move back and forth, but it was essentially stagnant. It was all wired, and everybody was able to listen to everybody else's communications. So somebody got the idea of using some of the Choctaw Native Americans as the radio operators to send the messages around on the battlefield. And so they decided to try that just before one attack that they were going to do on German lines. And they felt depending on what they encountered in that attack, they would be able to judge the success of using code talkers, what they referred to as the code talkers then. What they found out is the Germans had absolutely no idea that the attack was coming. And they moved further than they had ever done. In fact, they'd almost outreached their supply lines initially on that. So it was very popular. It was so popular and it was so effective that when Adolf Hitler came into power in the late 30s, he sent anthropologist spies to Oklahoma to learn the Native American languages. So when you get around to World War II and you hear about code talkers, you hear about them in the Pacific, not in the European theater. In fact, I think the more you learn about, or the more I learn about World War I keep referring to World War II as World War 1.2. It was simply an extension of the war. We've all heard of Victory Gardens? World War I. Heard of Rosie the River? She had a grandmother, and she worked in the factories in World War I. So we'll talk about that too. But one of the things that was going on here, common thread throughout these ethnic groups, is they were all fighting for acceptance. They thought that if they served their country, if they shed their blood, they did their part, that when they came back that they would be accepted. And unfortunately, that was not the case. So, but women took their own role during the First World War, and it was a huge role. I kind of gave you a little bit of a hint of that already. But the Red Cross became very active, and it was women doing bandages and all kinds of things here in the United States, to be able to send over to Europe to support. The women came out of the ranch houses and the farmhouses and started to work the land. There were any number of different service organizations, the National League of Women's Services, that started to work with all of the soldiers in the camps to provide morale and provide issues to help them adjust to their military life. Most of them come off of rural areas and have never been away from home very much. So things like the YMCA, the Salvation Army, the Knights of Columbus, the American Library Association, and some of the Jewish and Catholic leagues became known and became active in terms of helping the soldiers with morale. Women started to work in the factories and sign up to pledge for the food drives. They did the Victory Gardens. They did all kinds of different things. Started to taking roles within society that they never had before, whether it was working in factories or being office workers or driving ambulances and working with the Salvation Army and any of these others. They were all fully involved in the effort. Social turmoil, though. We had social turmoil throughout the entire time. Like I mentioned, this was not a popular war. There were probably as many people at some point in time who were against it who were for it. In fact, early on, you had Teddy Roosevelt, who lost the election to Woodrow Wilson. And Teddy Roosevelt was beating the drums constantly about getting into the war and supporting the war in Europe. But for a period of time here, we didn't know whether we were going to support the English or the French or the Germans, because we had a lot of Irish Americans here who would rather have gone to war against England than they would have against Germany. We had other people from some of the other countries that were here, Polish, Serbians, Croatians. Some of them wanted to side with the Germans, some of them didn't. So there was an awful lot of opinion here as to which way we wanted to go with this. But Germany, as a group, were probably singled out more than any other ethnic group in terms of bad feelings and bad attitudes. In fact, for a long time it became illegal to speak German in some places. If you were found reading German newspapers or listening to German music, it could be cause for arrest. The Mexican Americans, again, there was still prejudice against them, even though these people were all going into the service. I really like this one. Women bring all voters into the world, let women vote. And that's where the suffrage movement actually started. Like I said, it didn't develop into the national suffrage yet, but in many county elections, women were allowed to start to vote. And then this one on prohibition and booze. This is a couple of things that are going on here. One is that, like we mentioned, there were a lot of these soldiers who came into the military and they've left their homes and they've never been away from home very much, and so now they've got time in their hands and they're in areas. And from a morale standpoint, all of those other groups mentioned were doing whatever they could to try to keep the morale up and keep the soldiers away from things like prostitution and alcohol. In fact, that was a big issue here in Fort Worth. The regulations required that if you had a camp in your area, that you could not be selling alcohol or have any houses of prostitution within 5 miles of the camp. How far is Hell's Gap Acres or the Stockyards from where Camp Bowie was? Just outside of 5 miles. So the issue became so large and so pervasive for a while, the military came to the city and said, if you don't take care of what's going on in Hell's Gap Acres, we're going to remove the camp. Well, the camp was a huge economic engine here. So the city did what it could. Well, prohibition was not only a morale issue, but it also became a way of punishing German Americans. Because who made most of the beer in Texas? In Central Texas? German Americans. And so this is a way to economically punish German Americans by prohibiting alcohol. Okay. One of the other things that started up was the idea of interstate commerce. The idea of, in fact, in 1916, it was an Interstate Commerce Act, and the idea was to take one road and have it go from New York through Chicago to San Francisco, and the other one that some of us are familiar with that went from Washington, D.C. through the south to San Diego. The one that came through down here was called the Baghdad Highway. Now, we mentioned earlier that there were no paved roads for the most part. There was no standardization of wheelbases, so we had to do something if they're going to build an interstate highway that goes across. So this is the way the Bankhead Highway originally started out, was it was dirt road with some wood maybe across some ravines and things like that, but then eventually it became a paved highway. How did we determine how big to make that highway? Because what I told you with my father, it had taken them 3 weeks ago from South Dakota to San Diego, the idea here was to be able to get vehicles across the United States in a week or less. So they had to standardize the roads. So how did we come up with the size of the roads? Got it from the British. Because we were going to be using vehicles that they were using in Europe, so our vehicles had to be able to be accommodated on the roads, the highways, and the vehicles for transporting them in Europe. And the British got their roads from the Romans. But so we established our roads here for vehicles based on a 56-inch wheelbase. And so that's why today you drive on roads, drive vehicles, that the size was originally established in the First World War. So this is the way the Bankhead Highway started, with Army vehicles plowing through the bush trying to find the best routes across the state. And you'll notice there's a little pig in the python here in Texas. That's because a lot of people wanted this road to go through their towns. We're also involved with shipping and shipbuilding here in Texas to a huge extent. Now this picture is the Houston Ship Channel in 1904 when it opened. Any of you ever been down to Houston and seen the ship channel? Well, today, or then in 1904, you could pretty much throw a rock across it. This is Orange, Texas. And if you look right here, you'll see a white sailboat with 5 masts on it. Orange, Texas became the place that built the last sailing ships of the war. Each one of those ships took about 1 million board feet of lumber. And where did that lumber come from? East Texas. So Orange was building ships. They built 16 of these sailing ships. They also built other ships after that as the steam engines started to come in, but they were building lots and lots of wooden boats and steam engines. And in fact, shipbuilding was taking place all along the Texas coast. In fact, we built more boats here in the state of Texas than any other single state in the United States. And the government had decided that we needed to have 8,000 or 10,000 ships. I don't remember the exact number, but over 200 of them were built here. Not all of them were used, Some of them today have been, when they didn't need them any longer, they floated them out along the intercoastal waterway, and they burned them to the ground and sank them, and they're fish farms today. So they're still in business. But in Orange, Texas, it was a huge shipbuilding endeavor that was going on there. And it was wood that was coming out of East Texas, and what were they hauling to Europe? First of all, they were taking lumber. They were taking lumber from Texas to Europe that could be used on the battlefields and for building in Europe. They were taking cotton from Galveston and from Texas, and they were taking oil. So we were supplying war goods to Texas, or to Europe for the war, long before we actually entered the war. And so here's some of the cotton and, of course, oil from down in that area. So shipbuilding and shipping were a huge part of the Texas economy then. During the war, there were a lot of new technologies that started to emerge and made a huge difference on the battlefield. If you look at some of the soldiers who entered the war in 1914, they were carrying lances, they were carrying helmets with pikes on them, they were carrying swords, they were on horses. And as people have often said, in World War I, they rode in on horses and they flew out on airplanes. So a lot of new technologies emerged, and during this period of time, old technologies started to disappear. Submarine warfare was new. Machine guns were new. The use of chemical weapons was new. Some of these don't translate well into the civilian market, but one that did and made a huge impact is the emergence of aviation. That is the entire United States Air Force in 1911. That's it, whole thing. One airplane, one pilot. This gentleman right here is Benjamin Floyd. This is down in San Antonio, by the way. He had been given a whole 3 hours of instruction by the Wright brothers before they sent him off on a train to San Antonio to establish an Air Force. So this was it. That was the entire thing. That's called a Wright B flyer, and we had one of those visit here in Fort Worth in 1911 by a gentleman named Cal Rogers, but that was a civilian version. But anyway, this is the emergence of aviation. The first time anybody saw an airplane fly here in Texas was in 1910, and it was down in Houston. It was a group called the Moisant International Aviators. They were a flying circus, and they were going all over the United States, introducing aviation to the world. They came through here in Fort Worth. They came through Dallas. They came through a number of different places. By 1915, this was the type airplane that our Air Force had. Now, this was actually down along the border because aviation, military aviation was in its infancy and was used on our border for scouting purposes. They thought it would work. It didn't work out as well as they hoped. It was too arid. The props were wood. They would start to crack and that type of thing. But these airplanes, and this one in particular, came through Fort Worth in 1915. In fact, they stopped here. They were encouraged to come here by Amon Carter and some of the local businessmen. They'd left Texas City. They were coming through this area on their way down to San Antonio, where they were going to be based. So the entire Air Force of 6 airplanes came through here in Fort Worth in 1915. They got down there and then became part of the punitive expedition in 1916. But at the start of the war in Europe, we had less than 20 airplanes in the entire United States. By the time we entered the war, a few years later in 1917, we only had about 50 airplanes. When the war started, there were about 750 airplanes in the entire world. By the end of the war, there were over 250,000 airplanes in the war, or in the world. Today in the United States, there are 250,000 privately owned airplanes, and that's just here. So this is a fairly common picture. These airplanes, this is a JN4 Jenny, and these are referred to as JN1s. They were an earlier version. There were different airplanes used at different air bases. This was at Love Field. Love Field was a training base for the AEF, the Army, the U.S. Army. Considered part of the Signal Corps. Fairly common picture of the day is pilots and officers in front of their airplane. You can find these from San Antonio and Houston, and a lot of them here from Fort Worth. Fort Worth is different though, and we'll talk about that. So now we're going to take a step back and we're going to look at some other aspects of the war. That was the military buildup, or at least started. The stockyards actually started to be active with the war in 1914 when the war started. we started supplying horses and mules primarily, but also cattle to Europe in 1914. So we were obviously involved in the war at that point in time. And this was all out of the stockyards. Now, there will be another test over this part, but these are years. So in 1903, there were a total of 732,000 animals that went through our stockyards here in Fort Worth. By 1909, just prior to the war, we were up to just about 2.2 million. So that's huge growth in 6 years. Obviously, that's 300%, but that's where we were prior to the war. By 1917, the Fort Worth Stockyards was the largest livestock exchange in the entire world. That was also the high point of the activity of the stockyards. It has been downhill ever since. So, these are some of my new heroes. This is a little bit about an article from the Star Telegram about the economic impact of the forts and the military coming to Fort Worth. We all know who Benny Keith is, right? Or at least we recognize his trucks. Those big white trucks that say Benny Keith on them that we see every day. Ben Keith got started in 1906 in the business. He had a wagon, and he was working with a local company, and he would sell vegetables and fruit around town to the hotels and the restaurants and things like that. That business built up and built up. He bought the business just prior to the war, and in 1913, he and Eamon Carter established the Chamber of Commerce here in Fort Worth. The news was that the war was going on and that we would probably become involved in the war about 1917. He happened to be down in South Texas in Austin and San Antonio in April of 1917 when we declared for the war, and Benny Keith immediately came back up here to Fort Worth to energize people like the mayor of Fort Worth, who was William D. Davis during the war years, and also other members of the Chamber of Commerce. And he immediately decided that they had to have one of the military camps. There were going to be some built. We had to have one in Fort Worth. He also knew that there were going to be airfields built. He felt that we needed to have some of those airfields. And so he immediately had a group of local businessmen, mostly the Chamber of Commerce, that were encouraging that they go to the Army and that they get the Army to come and look at Fort Worth as a place to establish a military camp. So this Brigadier General Charles Morton was part of the inspection team that was supposed to come up, that did come up to Fort Worth to take a look at some of the locations that the Fort Worth business people had decided on. One of them was down off of Seminary near the Baptist College. There was another one in southwest Fort Worth that they came up to look at. But this gentleman, who was a doctor, and he was also at the time a major, named Holman Taylor, had been here and had done his studies on what he thought areas around Fort Worth would be suited for a military base. By the way, he's also the person who established the Red Cross here in Tarrant County. So at any rate, they came up here for this inspection along about May of 1917, and of course they're up all at this train station waiting for the inspection team to show up, and it's one of those kind of downpours that we have. I mean, just heavy, heavy downpour. So here's the people from the Chamber of Commerce going, well, this is not going to go well. So General Morton and his group go out and inspect the different sites, and meanwhile, Major Holman is telling Benny Keith, you need to go take a look at this place called Arlington Heights. He said, I've studied it, I've surveyed it, and it drains better than any place else. So after they showed Morton and his inspection team these other two places, they took him over to the Arlington Heights area, which had been a failed subdivision. They started in about 1880, and it just never really turned into much. So they go over there, and the generals are just delighted. I mean, the water's draining away from the area. Of course, that's not happening today, right? But at that point in time, in 1917, the water was draining, and they were just thrilled. They thought it was a great place to be able to build a fort. So they decided to build, not a fort, but a camp. So they decided to build Camp Bowie. So here's some of the economics of the day and what that translates into. A day laborer, at that point in time, would get $2.50 a day, about $47 a day. Carpenters, skilled labor, they were getting paid about 3 times more. So they're getting $8 a day, or about $150 a day. So Camp Bowie cost about $3 million to build. just like all of the other camps around the state. They cost about $3 million. In 1917 dollars, that equates to $65 million today. So we're going to start to look at these numbers and pile up and get an idea of the economic impact of the culture here. The total of the camps and the airfields, all of the other military facilities that were built here, totaled about $11 million, which in today's dollars is about $206 million. And a lot of that is here in this article. If you start reading newspapers at the time, they will tell you that everybody had to stand in line for everything. In April of 1917, when the war started, the population of Fort Worth was about 70,000 people. Within about 6 months, the population was up to as high as 140,000 people. With the advent of the soldiers coming here, and all the people who came to town to build all this stuff. So you read the papers and they talk about how you had to stand in line for lunch or dinner, you had to stand in line to get your mail, you had to stand in line to get a haircut, you had to stand in line to do everything that you wanted to do, you had to stand in line because the city could not handle it. Consider today, if that same kind of growth would take place here today in 6 months. If we went from 850,000 people today to by Christmas time, we've got 1.4 million people here in Fort Worth, what do you think would happen to the city? You can answer that one yourself. So that became a part of the huge impact. And this doesn't account for what was taking place at the stockyards. So this is the military impact for North Texas. Camp Bowie, which was a huge area, the Royal Flying Corps, airfields. At the same time, Benny Keith knew that there was the Royal Flying Corps was looking for areas in Texas to establish airfields, so that the Royal Flying Corps from Canada could come down here in the winter of 1917-18 and train away from the harsh winters. So here again, when Benjamin Floyd had come through the area in 1915, Benny Keith had met him. And so when it was time to go and see about airfields, Benny Keith went up to Washington, D.C. to talk to Benjamin Floyd about Fort Worth as a site for one of these airfields. Floyd didn't have time to stay at the meeting and talk with him. So he took out a cigarette paper and wrote on it, "Do what you can for this Texan," and handed it to the British General, General Horsley, or General Horace, and gave it to him. So General Horace came down, sent inspection teams down to take a look at the areas. Dallas wanted one, Waco wanted one, Wichita Falls wanted one, we wanted one of the fields. And General Horace made his decision and decided that all 3 of those Royal Flying Corps fields would be here in Fort Worth. All 3 of them. So they established airfields, and you will see the spelling on the panels out here as Taliaferro. I'm going to tell you a secret. You don't pronounce it Taliaferro. It's pronounced Taliaferro. Don't know why, but that's what it is. So at any rate, so they established the 3 airfields, and they were all referred to as Taliaferro 1, 2, 3 initially. And the Royal Flying Corps came down late in the year of 1917 and started to move into the airfields, which were not yet totally ready. One was in Saginaw, one was in what's Benbrook, and the other one was off Everman Parkway. And so they started to move in. They were intense. And then, how many of you or anybody here is a weather expert or somebody who's a weather historian? What happened in the winter of 1917 here? Largest snowfall in the history of Fort Worth. So the Canadians who were trying to get out of all of this stuff ended up and were right in the middle of it, and the camps weren't finished. So they would, you read stories about these gentlemen, and they would talk about going to the mess tent in the morning for breakfast, getting their breakfast. By the time they got back to their table, breakfast was frozen to their plate. And so that was kind of the way it took place. All of the airfields were essentially a cookie cutter design. All of them were built in Waco and in Houston and in San Antonio and in Mineral Wells and Dallas. They were all built essentially on the same design. There are virtually nothing left of any of these things now. And part of this that a lot of people are unfamiliar with is the helium production that took place here. You know, if you go up by Blue Mound and Terminal Road, there's a series of buildings up there that look somewhat governmental in nature. That was the helium plant. It was the only helium plant in the United States, and it was originally proposed by the Navy during the war, because we had discovered helium as a natural byproduct of natural gas. And so we had the only helium factory in the entire world, and it was considered a secret. But it was used for, we were saying, well, they were producing argon and it was for neon lights. So apparently, the north side and the stockyard areas were just crazy with neon lights all over there, but it was really for helium. And so later on in the 20s, we had some of the dirigibles and airships that came through here, and we were exporting it out. But this was all part of it. And then it was the introduction of aviation. This is it's referred to as a JN4 Jenny. This particular variety is referred to as a Canuck, because the Canadians did some modifications to the airplanes to make them more maneuverable, and these are the airplanes they brought in. And this is what people saw here on a daily basis. You will see other World War I airplanes that have stars and bars and things like that, but that's what everybody else used. We used the Canadian airplanes here. And they were all over the place. People saw them everywhere because we had the 3 fields here. And the pilots would very often fly to places like Grapevine or South Lake as cross-country flights. They'd go and land in the farmers' fields and meet the people up there. In fact, some of the exhibits that you will see in the lobby area are a set of wings that were carved out of the propeller of an airplane, and they were given to a Grapevine family who brought in some of these people during the winter of 1917 for the holidays. And it was a thank you gift to those people for that. You'll also see some other things here that, the Canadians brought their version of football here and started to establish some leagues. So there were a lot of other things that took place with the airplanes. They were all over the place. Some of them met some of the co-eds from TCU, and there are stories of them kind of doing stunts around TCU. One of them crashed into a dorm. There's another one that was putting on a private air show for somebody, and the engine quit, and he ended up landing on the football field during a football game. There's lots of crazy stories. But then this happened. Anybody recognize this particular picture? It's October 27, 1917 in Ranger. And this is when oil was discovered in north central Texas. Now, if you go out to Ranger today, you can find books out there that will tell you that Ranger won the war. And it's, in some respects, that's not that far-fetched. Now this is Texas and some of the oil fields, and you'll notice places like Desdemona and Ranger and Burke Burnett. It's all 1917, 1918, Breckenridge. This is all the oil fields that sprung up in that area. What was happening in Europe in 1917? This is October. So what else was going on in Europe in October of 1917? What was going on with the Russians?
The Russian Revolution.
The Russian Revolution, right? So the whole government in Russia, the imperial government in Russia was being dismantled. The Russians essentially were tired of war. They couldn't supply anything more, including oil and everything else. And Russia, for all intents and purposes, pulled out of the war in 1917, along with their oil and along with their armies. And so there was a big void, and we now have a machine that operates off of oil. And so that's why Ranger says we won the war, because a lot of oil came out of north central Texas. The Army and the Navy built a pipeline to Fort Worth and Dallas to be able to supply the needs. So I'm not from Texas, but when I first moved here about 30 years ago, and when I was a flight instructor down in Kingsville, I always remember there was an ad on TV. And the ad was, well, if you don't have an oil well, get one. Well, and this is a picture of, and I think this one is Burke Burnett, but it doesn't make any difference. All of those towns look like that. There is an oil well behind every building and virtually in every square acre there. So much so that people lived in tents. Excuse me. Ranger in October of 1917 had a population of 800 people. Within 6 months, the population of Ranger was 30,000. So much so that one of the first things that people were buying when they were getting money from the oil wells was what? Cars. So if you'll take a look, this is a street of Desdemona, I think it is. Maybe it is, that may be Ranger, but at any rate, they're all the same. A muddy street with a lot of cars. And just clogged up towns. Now, most of that oil and the money left, because anybody been to Ranger in a while? Not a lot in Ranger, right? But during that period of time, there were as many as 50 oil companies here in Fort Worth. And they really can't even tell you to this day how much oil came out of there. People used to make a big deal out of it when their oil well was producing 5,000 barrels a day, which is a lot of oil. It doesn't make any difference how much it's paying, it's a lot of oil. And so many, many millionaires were created during the oil. The money didn't stay in Reno. The money came other places like here at Fort Worth and Dallas. So the oil boom expenditures in 1914 was worth $11 million. That's in 1914 dollars. Remember, it said Camp Bowie cost $3 million to build in 1917. In 1917, the oil industry was worth, in North Texas, was worth $23 million. That's in their days. Or today, that's $2 billion today. $2 billion today, just from the oil portion of it. So now we're going to go back to the livestock just a bit. Again, here's 1917, 18, and the different animals that are being processed. So 1917, remember we went 1909 from about 2.25 million. We're up to over 3.5 million animals in 1917, and that number decreases, and it's gone down since then. We did 1.5 million cattle through the stockyards last year, but not one hair of any one of those animals passed through town. And one of the things that killed this whole stockyards issue were the interstate highway system. Once the interstate highway system was established and trucks and refrigerator trucks were established, you no longer had to have big centers for slaughterhouses and the railroads. And so that's where the downfall on that started, the domino effect on that. So at any rate, the dollars in 2017 dollars for the stockyards operation for the war years is $17 billion today. Still a lot of money. So when we take a look at other economic impact factors from 1917 and 18, industry was about $5 billion plus. It's a little bit difficult to determine some of this stuff because, for instance, remember the General Motors plant that was down by the Montgomery Plaza area? At the time it was established, that wasn't Fort Worth. So manufacturers like Ford and Chevrolet came to town. All of the lots of other industries came to town, and that totaled about $5 billion plus. Agriculture was about $7 billion plus during the war years. So the total Fort Worth impact in 2017 dollars is what? Anybody want to guess? And this is all guesswork, but you want to guess? $50 billion. And that's over a period of 4 years, or less, depending on what time frame you use. Now, what does that mean in dollars per person? So if we look at 100,000 people or so, that's $500,000 for every man, woman, and child in the city of Fort Worth. Then that was the impact. Now, obviously, not everybody in town got $500,000 out of the deal, right? Some people were getting $47 a day. So that just means that there were some people in the area here who were getting extremely wealthy because of the war effort and what was going on with the war effort. And so what does that translate into today? How much does an F-35 cost? 100 million. So that's the equivalent of 500 F-35s, which is about what the initial contract was for. And that's going to be over a very much larger period of time. Of course, that's not an overall impact, but that's about $62,000 for every man, woman, and child in the city of Fort Worth. So you can see that the impact on the individual during that period of time during the war was huge compared to everything else. And it completely transformed Texas from a very little cow town into an industrial area and an industrial center. So we'll go back and take a look at 1920 and 1930, and here's the populations. We already looked at those, but by 1920, Houston has grown to 106,000 from 73,000. By 1920, the population had already started to come back down from the impact of the war. For a period of time here, Fort Worth was actually larger than Dallas. And then by 1930, Fort Worth has still stayed just about steady, although it has reduced somewhat. San Antonio is no longer number one. Houston has surpassed it, and Dallas has still remained number two. So here's some of the aftermath of the war. People came into the cities for jobs. Voting rights changed. Prohibition was in effect. Prejudice was still prevalent throughout the area. but there was a whole new economics. There was this during this period of time, regulations of businesses, whether it be banking or manufacturing, all types of businesses started to become regulated because of the excesses that had taken place in the 1800s, 1890s, and early 1910s. But this is the other impact that came out after the aftermath of the war, with some of the vacuum of things that were taking place. The Klan arrived here in the United States, or they arrived here in the South. And then there was another effect. During the war years, cities up north, Chicago, Detroit, Pittsburgh, any number of cities up north, were advertising to the newspapers down here to the South, to the African Americans, come up north. We're going to treat you better. We've got more jobs. It's going to be a better lifestyle up here. Come up north. And so that period of time is referred to as the Great Migration from 1916 to 1930 of African Americans leaving the South from all over the South and going up to the north and out to the West Coast. Now, through our research and looking at veterans, we've also found another effect that took place, which we refer to as reverse migration. We have records on about 7,000 veterans from here in Tarrant County. And when we started looking at them, we were starting to scratch our heads about it, because a lot of them were from Texas, but a lot of them were from Illinois, Wisconsin, Nebraska, Canada, places up north. And we couldn't figure out exactly what that was. And then all of a sudden it dawned on us. When Woodrow Wilson in 1916 federalized all of the state militias and required them to come down south for the border expeditions, 43 of the 48 states' militias, National Guards, came to Texas and served in Texas. They either came down for training or they were stationed along the border for the border patrols that took place down there. After the war, when these people left, and remember, half of the military establishments in the United States were in Texas, after the war, these people decided, I'm not going to go back to live in Illinois, Wisconsin, Michigan, and spend those winters up there any longer. They found out what a warm winter was like. And so many of them moved down to Texas. Now, notable Texans. We talk a lot about schools and working with the schools, and you may all be familiar with the Texas Essential Skills and Knowledge. The First World War is mentioned in 4th grade, taught very minutely in 7th grade, and then in advanced placement classes in high school, it's taught in the 11th grade. Part of the teach is talking about individuals that were notable during these time periods. For the First World War, it only talks about 2 people. A lady named Catherine Stinson, who was a female aviator at the time from down in the San Antonio area, and a lady named Bessie Coleman, who was the first licensed African-American pilot in the world. The problem is, Catherine Stinson wasn't allowed to serve. She ended up being an ambulance driver. And Bessie Coleman, other than probably seeing airplanes fly during the time period, has nothing to do with the First World War. But that's a fallacy when we have people like Edward House. Edward House, Colonel House, was referred to as the assistant president. He was Woodrow Wilson's right-hand man. Not the president, not elected, but he's from Texas, and he was Woodrow Wilson's chief advisor. A gentleman named David Barclay. Anybody know that name? David Barclay was a Medal of Honor recipient. He was also Mexican-American. But nobody knew that until many years after the war. Marcelino Serna, also Mexican-American. His exploits during the war, he was maybe the most decorated soldier for the United States during the entire war. He was put up for the Congressional Medal of Honor on a number of different occasions, but he was told he was a private and his English wasn't that good. David Barclay, by the way, was Mexican-American. He was awarded the Medal of Honor. Marcelino Serna, even after the war, has not been able to. 2 weeks ago, they named one of the bridges in El Paso going into Mexico in honor of Marcelino Serna. Walter Potts, African-American from Denison. There's a great book about him. It's called The Last Buffalo. And it's his story as being a buffalo soldier. They were named buffalo soldiers primarily by the French. The French called them buffalo soldiers because they felt there was great strength and courage within the Buffaloes, and they all wore, many of them wore buffalo patches on their uniforms. And so there's a great story about him and his experiences as a fighter. Again, most of them were not allowed to fight, but Walter ended up being involved with a unit out of New York that did get into combat with the French. The African Americans also introduced jazz to Europe, if you're not aware of that. Catherine Stinson, they called her the schoolgirl pilot. Catherine was down in San Antonio. She'd been flying for many, many years before the war started and offered to be a trainer and train pilots down in San Antonio, and the Army just said, no, you're a girl, we can't let you do that. So she ended up going to Europe and being an ambulance driver. Chester Nimitz is from the Fredericksburg area. Was a new young ensign during the First World War. Dwight Eisenhower was from here. He was not allowed to go to Europe, which troubled him a lot. He wanted to go to Europe. He had been put in charge of the Interstate Highway Program for the military. And then a gentleman named John Thomason, Marine, from down in the San Antonio area. He was a writer and an artist. And if you would be interested in a book that will give you some feel for what the battlefield was like, he wrote a book called Fixed Bayonets. And what's special about his is not only is he a good writer, but he was a good artist. So his book is accompanied with his sketches of the time. But none of these people, other than Catherine Stinson, is shown in, or is an example in the Texas Essential Knowledge and Skills. And there are many, many others. You know, we've got Benny Keith and what he did. We've got Eamon Carter and some of the other folks. At any rate, we're going to kind of just bring it update and say here's today. Spindletop in 1902. Well, what does that become? It was one of the refineries down in the Houston area. Oil, obviously, has been one of the new technologies that came in during that time period and just became huge. Houston Ship Channel, 1904. There it is today. One of the largest shipping channels in the entire world. Agriculture and cotton in Texas. Still with us, but it's mechanized. It's not near the kind of labor-intensive operation that it used to be. And now, today, it's being done mostly by corporations. Transportation. We've got the wagon down there in Mission with the ox and everything. That's what it is today. I'm not sure that's an improvement, but that's what it is today. And then, of course, the ranches. We still have ranches, and we still deal with cattle. And aviation. That's DFW. That's one of the largest economic engines in the entire state of Texas, is what's going on with aviation here in North Texas. So to give you an idea what aviation has done from zero to where it is today, this is an exhibit that we have at the museum, and those are all little airsoft BBs in there, and each one of those represents an airplane that's been built here in North Texas. Anybody want to guess how many are in there? Okay. There's 68,000 and counting. And those airplanes, the economic impact to the state, or to specifically our area, is $1 trillion. And I say that's just for starters, because that doesn't include all of the houses, churches, grocery stores, gas stations, roads, and vehicles that it's taken to be able to take care of everybody up here and service all of the people who come into the area and build airplanes. All these green ones, for instance, are mostly Bell helicopters during the Vietnam era. These are the Second World planes here. So how many is 68,000 or 70,000 and $1 trillion? First flight took place here January 12, 1911. So if we started building airplanes that day, it would be 2 airplanes a day, every day, for 106 years. And how much is $1 trillion? That's $22 million a day, every day, for 106 years. So, here in North Texas, 600,000 jobs are aviation related. That's 1 in 5. It's one of the highest percentages of anywhere in the United States. Total economic impact is $40 billion a year from aviation. DFW serves 63 million people and handles 1.5 million tons of pounds of cargo. But one of the bigger issues here, and why so many of us are unfamiliar with not only aviation, but also the First World War and the impact that it's had here, is 50% of the population here today didn't live here 25 years ago, and there are virtually no landmarks for you to go and see. There is no Camp Bowie. There is no Tolliver 1 or 2 or 3 or Hicksfield or Benbrook or Carruthers. We walk on this history every day, but it's not visible. So if you want to look at more, find out more, suggest that you go to the National Centennial Commission website. Tons and tons of information there. The Camp Mabry down in Austin has the Texas Military Forces Museum. They have all of the registration cards of those 200,000 Texans who served. We are one of only 3 states that have the original cards. They were all supposed to get turned in and go to the archives in St. Louis, and everybody else's cards that went there got burned up in a fire. But we've got ours. They've got them down there, and they are available online. Texas Time Travels. The Texas Historic Commission has put together an app for your phone that's called Texas Time Travels. It's a free app, you download it, and it has the Texas Time Travels tour of the state of Texas for World War I. So it will lead you around the state with a number of videos and other things about all of the different things, or some of the different things that took place all around the state during the First World War. Texas Historical Commission has put out a special edition. The Texas State Library and Archives. This is the logo for the Texas World War I Centennial Association that Mary mentioned. There's a group of 600 or 700 people and organizations across the state that are doing whatever we can across the state to further this. No Man's Land. This is about the East Texas African Americans in World War I. It's very, very good. And the Texas State Historic Commission, and for any of you who are dealing with educational issues, K-12 is a site where you can go and get all kinds of curriculum and educational things for different age levels. So this is the website that we have here in Texas for the Texas World War I Centennial Commemoration. We also have a Facebook page. So here's what I'm going to ask you to do for the next couple of years. And here's how you can participate in the First World War. Number 1 is poppies. Plant them, learn about them, teach them, wear them. It's the remembrance flower. It has been in Europe and Canada since the First World War, but most people only recognize it as something that's given out on Veterans Day by the American Legion and the VFW. It is the remembrance flower. It started out as just those who died during the First World War. It has now become known as the remembrance flower for any U.S. service person, regardless of whether they gave their life or not. They're easy to plant. They're weeds. But it's the only thing that grew in no man's land. That's the significance. In no man's land in Europe during the First World War, when there was just death and destruction, during the spring, the poppies would grow. People, find them, remember them, and honor them. This is not just veterans. This is anybody that you know or was a family member during the First World War that lived here in the area. I'm going to show you how you're going to be able to help with that. But you can do it yourself. Look up your own family members. Did you have somebody in the First World War? Bring them back to life. And places. Find the places, refurbish them, and commemorate them. Virtually every town or every county courthouse has some kind of a World War I memorial. They're all over the state. Does anybody know what the biggest one in the state of Texas is? Anybody a UT fan? You can admit that if you want, it's okay. Texas Memorial Stadium at the University of Texas is the largest World War I monument or memorial in the state of Texas. It was built to honor the veterans of the First World War. There's a big, huge plaque on the side with over 5,000 names of Texans. And are you familiar with the Texas Tower? And in front of that, there's a big fountain. That's another World War I memorial. They are all over the state. So, some of them have been in disrepair and gone out of use. Find them, clean them up. I mean, these are simple ways to be able to do that. Now, the North Texas Challenge for our next exhibit. This exhibit will run through October. We will be doing another one in 2018, which will start in November and go through to February of 2019. And our working title on it is "Remember Me." These are graffiti drawings that have been found in France in private quarries and caves, and they're finding them all over the place. These are both from Texas. That's the 90th Division, the Texas-Oklahoma Division. and this is from another Texan in Haywood. And as one person mentioned in an exhibition that I went to recently, graffiti is nothing more than individuals trying to say, remember me. I was here, remember me. And so what we want to do in the next exhibition is try to remember the people of North Texas who were involved in the First World War. Not just veterans, people like Benny Keith, people like Coleman Taylor, other people who were involved, civic leaders, community leaders, business leaders. And so we're going to do our exhibit here, and it's going to revolve around the people and their stories. So, North Texas Challenge, help us to remember them. And you can contact any one of us at the library in Mary or us at the museum. We also have a little newsletter that we send out to other participants around the state, and we'd like to keep you involved. But for now, are there any questions? Okay, well with that, I appreciate your being here this afternoon. So when you drive home today, remember that you're driving on a road that was brought to us by the First World War. And also, we've got many other programs. If you had the opportunity to see the exhibit, we have it broken up into different sections. Somebody over the next few months will be doing presentations on each of those sections, as well as the film series that we do. We did Wings the other night. We're going to be doing 10 or 11 other films over the next few months. So we look forward to having you back, and thanks again.